Well, good morning. I'm certainly thankful and honored to be here for this series of lectures and lessons regarding defending the faith. I'm thankful for all of us who are here and everyone who's viewing us online. We certainly live in a unique time, don't we? And yet the need to be informed, the need to be encouraged, and to be reminded of the words of the Apostle Peter that we must have an answer to those that might ask us a question for the reason of the hope that we have within us. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15 is ever present, whether we are social distancing, whether we are not, whether we are masked, whether we are not. The responsibility of us to be God's people with answers, thoughtful answers to important questions doesn't go away, doesn't shy away from times of hardship. So I'm thankful that I'm a part of this event, and I'm thankful for the congregation for hosting this event. When Jason Hyde asked me to speak on this particular topic, we started fleshing out some ideas. And one of the things that I immediately thought about is this is a very large topic. It's very broad. And we could spend a lot of time just outlining different places in the Old Testament that create moral concerns from people today. And if we just answered questions based on that alone, moral concerns from people's perspectives today, we would have a very long study. We would be here for a really long time. Part of the issue is we live I doubt it's new to any generation, but in our particular setting, there's just such widespread criticism of the Bible that anything, if the Bible said anything, even if God had a hiccup, why does God have a hiccup? What is going on there? Could he not make an esophagus that never had muscular problems, right? Everything is under the microscope. Everything is suspect, everything. Now, that being said, there are some concerns and questions that come up, even for Christians, that we don't always seem to have a comfortable answer for. And I think one that has been a very old one, and in fact, it began, it really was put into the spotlight in the early church, not the biblical church, but years after, by a guy named Marcion, who said there seems to be like a really big moral distance between Jesus and the God of the Old Testament. You get this, when you read the Bible just superficially, you get this, Jesus will hang out with tax collectors, sinners, prostitutes. But in the Old Testament, it just seems God is ready to just smite everything and everyone, right? And it fueled some things for him, which eventually created some other problems. And that's the way that works. But I don't think that that's necessarily gone away, that curiosity. How does a Christian make sense with the ethic that Jesus teaches us, love your neighbor as yourself? How do we make sense of many things in the Old Testament when there's a lot of violence in the Old Testament, for example, and that's one of the areas we're going to concentrate on today. A lot of violence in the Old Testament, not just in the historical narratives, from the beginning to even through the poetry books. Even through wisdom literature. Like in the Psalms, you'll have particular Psalms that might say, Lord, could you dash the children's heads of my enemies against the rocks? How does a Christian say, how do I pray that and love my neighbor as myself? Right? I mean, that's a real question. That can create a dilemma. It creates a dilemma if we don't think through it properly. That's going to be my my point, my main broad point. is if we don't evaluate it properly, these questions can become a moral or spiritual crisis. That maybe we haven't been reading the Bible right, or maybe my God isn't my God who I thought my God was. But then you get even in the wisdom books, things like in the book of Proverbs, where you read about sexual indiscretions and how they lead to death. And you begin to wonder, that doesn't, our culture really doesn't like that kind of language. We're a very sexually free culture, and we don't want any restraint. So to opine or to say that if you're involved in some sexually explicit activity, then you're automatically, inviting death, that just seems, the young kids are scratching their heads. But I just want to show this person I care for them. I mean, that's where we are right now. There's no more consideration than wait till marriage. It's more, this is an expression of my love for this person when viewed from a far more wholesome perspective. I mean, there's the other perspective, just, love the one you're with, or you don't even have to love the one you're with, right? So there's a perspective. The first thing I want to say and something to consider is when we're looking at the Old Testament and in any ancient document, really, we have to realize that we're separated by a lot of time and culture. A lot of time, society and culture has gone under the proverbial bridge. Now, you might say it's God's word. It should be everlasting. And I'm going to affirm I believe that. I believe the Bible is everlasting. It is eternal. It will accomplish what God sent it to accomplish. God's word will stand. The grass will fade and wither, but the word of the Lord will abide forever. I affirm that. I believe that. But we also have to realize that God was speaking to particular people in particular situations. And we don't always have similar life experiences. So we do not, for example, live in a theocracy. We live in a democracy or a republic. And we have a very different political system than Israel, with a king, with a monarchy, with a civil code that was also a religious code. We have a civil code that sometimes is moral and sometimes is immoral. Legality does not prove morality in our culture and society. It just proves what will not be punished and what will be acceptable. But in Israel, morality was, quote unquote, legislated. It had civic and moral, spiritual, consequences. So we are distanced from that sort of environment. So it's easy in our Western context to look at the Bible and have an individualistic perspective of who I am, what I want, who can tell me what I can do, and who can tell me what I can't do. Right? Who can do that, right? And I can read the Bible and I might look at that and go, wow, well, that might be what he said to them, but there's no way I could do that in my life. It becomes a question of your heart. It becomes a question of you're willing to obey, but it also becomes a question of how you interpret what you bring to the table. And that's really my point here. We're separated from the Old Testament texts, close to, 2,000, 2,500 years at the earliest from the later stories of the Old Testament, and up to 3,000, if not 3,500 years to the earliest events of Israel's story. So when we come then, not just in time, but think about culture and think about how the different expectations, and God is speaking to these people. There's a different worldview that's being addressed by God. And that is often essential when we think about what's happening here in the Old Testament. We always have to realize, what did the Bible mean to the original audiences, so that I can understand how to apply it to myself today. If we don't do that first, we often skip and might often miss things. And worst of all, we might import things into the text that were never intended to be there. So what I'm deciding to do, instead of this lesson being a shotgun lesson covering everything possible under the banner of the Old Testament, that could be a question of whether or not God is morally unjust. We could cover things like the flood. We can cover things like God asking Abraham to offer up his son. We could talk about a variety of things. In fact, I'll bring up 3 categories raised by one concerned follower of Jesus in just a moment. But I'm going to focus on the question of genocide in the book of Joshua and the conquest, because I think in one way, one of the most visceral questions. It's one of the questions that really are made to stop and think, especially with passages like, leave no one alive, women, men, children. Is this the same God that Jesus is telling me about? This is the sort of question that pops up to the minds of people. And when maybe if you've grown up with the Bible and you've trusted it as the inerrant word of God, you perhaps have approached it with, well, God knows best. I may not understand everything, but my faith in God is at such a high level that God, if that's what he asked, there was a reason for it, and it is right. To quote Abraham, shall not the judge of all the earth do right? And so from that point of view, some of us might say, I feel I'm comfortable with an answer, but for a world that we live in, especially in our society, and our society is catching up to a lot of other places to becoming less spiritual and being a post-Christian environment, a lot of people who come to the Bible with no cherished history of Bible school or cradle roll or anything like that, they come to the Bible with a very different perspective. And it's important, if we're going to reach our world today, to hear their questions. And so that's why I've chosen this particular one, because it is one of the most often cited. And frankly, it's one that we have just enough time for to at least provide a few points. Now, speaking to that, let me say this. I probably will not give you an airtight argument. Not that there isn't one. But what I really want to do and accomplish today is give you some talking points and ways to talk about this particular text and this particular question. I think that will help us better engage people who raise this question. So that's going to be my point of view. And I apologize up front if I don't give you perhaps all the details and information you might be hoping for. But I think this is a good process, and I hope that it bears out this way. So back in 2017, an article appeared by a man by the name of Ian Johnson in The Independent. It said, Bible says Canaanites were wiped out by Israelites, but scientists just found their descendants living in Lebanon. So what's the implied thesis of that article title? The Bible lied. You can't trust the Bible, right? There's Canaanites today. Well, that would be a shocking surprise, since there were Canaanites in the days of Jesus. Jesus interacted with Canaanites. King David dealt with Canaanites. After the reign of Saul, David still had to deal with the Philistines. In fact, one of his mighty men was a Hittite, the one that he stole, and Uriah, he stole Bathsheba from and then killed him. So that's really not a surprise to anyone who's been reading the Bible. But this goes, I quote and mention this article because it points to a commonly held view that the biblical story is all about genocide on the Canaanites, that the Israelites completely wiped out and obliterated the Canaanites. because that was, quote unquote, their intended goal. Now, in saying that, I've run into many Christians who've also held that view. That is not, from my assessment, what the Bible and what God's charge to Israel in that particular time and setting was about. It was not a genocide. We'll get into some of the language, but essentially it was to create a space for the nation of Israel to live in the land that God promised Abraham, and to remove those that will not leave the land, the Canaanites that would not leave, and force them or offer them peace if they wish to change, or war against them. And the events we end up reading about are those cities that did not take, believe it or not, the peace treaties that Israel offered them. We'll get into that also. But this raises a question. How do people view God then based off this? One, the Bible doesn't tell the truth. Two, we're going to now attack God. If you ever heard of the infamous Richard Dawkins, he's a skeptic. He's part of this new trend in atheism called New Atheism. It's been around for a little bit now. And the whole intended purpose of the New Atheism model is to tell the world that the reason why there's so many problems is because of religion. Religion is the reason why we have all these wars. Religion is the main culprit behind all of our problems. If there was no religion, there would be no problems. So we're going to attack faiths head on. So this is what he said about the Old Testament God. And this is how it connects to our study also. In his book, in 2006, he wrote a book called The God Delusion. He said this: the God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all of fiction. Jealous and proud of it. A petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak. A vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser. A misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully. Period. That was all one sentence. Well, that was a mouthful. It's kind of like reading a genealogy. But did you hear that, though? He's the most unpleasant character in all of fiction. Number one, lining up again with Ian Johnson's article, right? Canaanites still exist. The Bible's wrong. Doesn't tell the whole truth or any truth. It's a parable. But the other side is the description of God based on some of these stories. That the language that God uses, like I'm a jealous God, I'm a holy God, that he does have commands that he expects his people to follow, makes him a control freak. All of this superficial criticism of God is part of the conversation that's at the table that we're at right now. And it's really important then, again, to take into account this perspective, because it's not an isolated view. There's a reason why churches are shrinking. There's a reason why young people lose faith right after college or right during college. And if they regain it, it takes them to have their own family wanting to share faith that they have, but haven't really developed. And it takes a decade for them to come back. At least that's the current statistic, if that happens at all. So this raises the question, from the skeptical world, this is how God is viewed. And it becomes, of course, a problem. What I'm going to do, though, is I'm going to walk through what the story says and point out three things. That one, what we're seeing in the stories of the conquest and settlement of Canaan and the wars and the violence there is a bigger picture There's a bigger picture at stake here. And one of them is, in the ancient world, God is demonstrating his greatness over the false gods of the ancient world. He just showed off in Egypt, if I can use the word showed off. Because glory, the word glory can also mean, to speak highly of, right? He just showed how powerful he was. He took on all the gods of Egypt in the 10 plagues and took on Pharaoh with the last one. So much so, and we'll get into this. I'm just highlighting here, but that's the first one. God is revealing himself through Israel in the ancient Near East. He was revealing his greatness and superiority over the Canaanite deities. The second one, warring had another purpose, and it was, in addition to fulfilling his promise to Abraham, Israel was also used to root out pagan religions and its crimes against humanity from the area where Israel would dwell. As a quick point here, the human sacrifice practices of the Canaanites were widely spread and widely practiced. Number 3, we're going to look at Israel was given guidelines to restrain itself from actually getting involved in genocide. In other words, they were, yes, charged to go and to war and to fight and to kill and to level cities, particular cities that had to do with idol practices. But they were also given commandments that restrained them from committing genocide. And I'm not even going to really get into the fact that Israel didn't completely accomplish what God sent them to do anyways, but they were never intended to genocide, is my point. That is specific and limited focus in the conquest stories. So one quick thing, and I added this morning here, so excuse me for the sort of last minute addition here, but there's a book I have by a man who, his name is Adam Hamilton. It's called Making Sense of the Bible. And what he does as a person of faith is he says, the stories like this really do bother him personally. They bother him. Primarily because, as I said before, Jesus and the God of the Old Testament just don't seem to line up. He accepts Jesus as the true word of God. He accepts Jesus that in him we know how to have access to God. But that in the Old Testament, essentially, we're dealing with a very different beast. We're dealing with just how people try to understand their actions by appealing to God. This is what God would want us to do. Not that God commanded them to attack the Canaanites, but we think God wants us to. So that's what we're going to do. So nothing that they did, anything that is a violation of Jesus' ethics, cannot be from God. That's how you make sense of this. For example, he raises 3 categories of violence. He says, the death penalty for crimes like idolatry or sexual deviancy, in that he lists like prostitution or homosexuality, or even Sabbath violations, seems so over the top. It can only be from the mind of a human being. And he's only saying, well, God said to do it, so that's why we're killing you. He looks at when God gets angry and wrathful and says, well, Exodus 32, when Moses comes down from the Mount Sinai and he commands the Levites to kill approximately 3,000 people involved in the worship of the golden calf. He says, could you imagine God asking you to kill your neighbor, your cousin, your family member, because they practiced idolatry? God is surely being over the top. That had to be then, since that doesn't match up with Jesus, because Jesus would never ask you to kill your neighbor, it had to be something that a human being came up with. So that's not from God. Genocide then, as we've talked about here, also fits under the category. And what he ends up doing, and I'm not going to spend more time on him, but I want you to understand where some believers are at. They will eventually say most of the Old Testament is a very human book. And what they mean by that is human beings wrote the book and they've inserted their actions and have colored their actions by what they think God wanted them to do. And so this now makes the Bible very untrustworthy, very human, because how are you going to tell the difference? My criticism here of Adam Hamilton's argument is, if the Bible is a very human book, and I know the Bible was written by human beings. I know it didn't just drop out of heaven in its present form. I get it. But human beings were used to write these books, pen these documents, and arrange them as they are now. But if God was not involved in these stories, how can you splice out, cut out? What tools do you have? You say Jesus, fine. But you know what the New Testament says about Jesus? Jesus is not just referring to God. He is God. John 1:1. His closest disciples claim in John 1:1, in the beginning was the Word. He's echoing the book of Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. Everything came into being through that Word. There's not a single thing that has come into existence apart from him. So the claim about Jesus is not just that he is a Messiah, a religious leader, and even the key to understanding God. He is God. And he never distances himself from the God of the Old Testament, nor does he deny the things that happened in the past. We have to realize that the situation that Jesus is in is a very different situation than the Israelites are in. And God is doing something consistent with the new situation, the Jewish nation under captivity, under Rome. And he's bringing forth a kingdom that is not going to be limited to territory. It's not going to be limited to earthly dynasty in that sense. It's a very different situation. But unfortunately, this is a view that is growing even among us, a view that the Bible is just a very human book. I could quote you plenty of articles that I've been reading from our own professors in some of our schools. And this is the approach they're going with. So I bring that up to say this has serious consequences. So this is my approach. We're going to be looking at those three areas. God is revealing himself and his greatness over the Canaanite deities. The warring had a lot to do with the pagan religions and its crimes against humanity, and also had to do with there are commands that restrained Israel from committing genocide itself. So all of this criticism, right, brings up a question. What right do we have to morally critique God? Right? If we're going to ask, so how could God even let this even happen? We're assuming we have the moral right to critique him, which assumes again that we have a moral standard that we're appealing to. Because if my criticism is just uniquely mine, then it's just a subjective situation, right? If you have an opinion and you have an opinion and you have an opinion and you have an opinion, right? Go Dodgers, go, right? If you have an opinion, go Giants. If you have an opinion, then it's just an opinion. And your opinion only matters in the community you're in. So if you are, for example, using the sports analogy, if you're in LA area, majority of your people might be go Dodgers. But if you go up north, it might be something go A's or go Giants. At what point can you morally say everyone has to be a Dodger fan? You can't, really. It's just a social contract. It's a social agreement that we all root for the home team. And maybe you've been rooting for your whole life. And maybe baseball is not your thing, and basketball is not your thing. Maybe rugby is your thing. Maybe soccer is your thing. But again, it's just a social contract. And at that point, your critique of other people's teams has a very limited power behind it. But if we're talking about a moral thing that everyone is responsible to, everyone's accountable to, now we all have to be on the same team. And then we are arguing about what team we're on. We're still pointing, well, this is something we all have to do. And even though it might be a worn out argument or example, after World War II, in the Nuremberg trials, Nuremberg, Germany was where the idea came to how to handle the answer to the Jewish question, the ultimate answer to the Jewish question, which was ultimately concentration camps and extermination, actual, full, intended genocide. And so in the Nuremberg trials, the argument was made that Germany could not be tried based on the provincial laws of other nations because Germany is an independent nation and is not subject to the laws of America, is not subject to the laws of other unions. It is its own independent state. It could not be tried by the standards of its own internal laws because according to German law, what they were doing was legal. So how did the world judge Germany? Well, the justice argued for, we are appealing to a higher law that transcends provincial laws, that transcends our subjective moralities. That's how they got the judgment against the Germans post-World War II. A higher law was at stake here. And the thing is, we might all agree on that there is sort of an implied higher law. The problem with the atheist and the skeptic isn't that they have no morals, not even absolute morals. They actually do have absolute morals. The problem is, as pointed out by one Christian thinker, Timothy Keller, is they just have no basis for having absolute morals. They have them, they just don't have a basis for it. The problem then is, I think, clear for us. For the skeptic and the atheist, in particular the atheist, they really don't have a moral ground or a moral footing to attack something universally. Say, everyone should think this is wrong because in their world, they don't have a higher moral standard. Their worldview just cannot allow it. It's inconsistent with the pattern of thinking that they offer the world. In the atheistic world, it's just us, it's just me, there's no one else. So morality then is, again, my favorite baseball team, my favorite football team, my favorite rugby team. That's what morality is in their world. So they have a massive wall to climb without any rope or scaffolding to approach a moral criticism of God. Yet they're doing it, and it's part of the conversation, and we can't just say, well, you don't have a right to ask this question. You know, it's like, go away, little child, go to your room, I'm busy. We can't do that. We have to talk. We have to engage. The real question, I think, is this: how do you handle an unjust society? Let us set aside these questions here in criticism. How do you handle the idea of an unjust society? How long do you let an unjust society continue? Would an atheist say that an unjust society can just go on forever? I honestly think that no atheist would say that. In fact, even an atheist as serious as Sam Harris, I don't think he would ever argue that, no, sure, unjust societies should just go on and indefinitely. No, he's arguing, part of the new atheism, to get rid of unjust society by getting rid of religion. So no one would ever say, just let an unjust society continue. So we have to ask the question, well, does God get that right too? Does God get a right to judge an unjust society? I'd argue he does. If we have the right to, surely he does. And that really is at the core of what's going on in the Canaanite story. Because at the base of their religion, of the Canaanite religion, were the gods, and many of them with their local deities, and many with their various combined religious practices that included female and male prostitution and human sacrifice, adultery, temple sex. I'm going to get into some gross stuff in just a second. Some bestiality, homosexual acts, child sacrifice were also permitted. Listen to this warning in Leviticus 18, beginning in verse 20. You shall not lie sexually with your neighbor's wife and so make yourself unclean with her. You should not give any of your children to offer them to Molech, a Canaanite deity, and so profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. You should not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination. And you should not lie with any animal and so make yourself unclean with it. Neither shall any woman give herself to an animal to lie with it. It is perversion. It is not just perversion on the face of it. It is perversion in connection to Canaanite practices of worship. Do not make yourself unclean by any of these things. For by these, the nations I am driving out before you, the Canaanites, you have become unclean. And the land became unclean, so that I punished its iniquity. And the land vomited out its inhabitants. But you shall keep my statutes and my rules, and do none of these abominations, either the native or the stranger who sojourns among you. For the people of the land who were before you did all these abominations, so that the land became unclean, lest the land vomit you out when you make it unclean, as it vomited out the nation that was before you. For everyone who does any of these abominations, the persons who do them shall be cut off from among their people. So keep my charge never to practice any of these abominable customs that were practiced before you, and never to make yourself unclean by them. I am the Lord your God. So they were offering up their children. They were having sexual intercourse with animals, same-sex activity. You know, culturally speaking, we're not very different right now, unfortunately. I'm not saying that it's uniquely now that we're not very different, but we're not far off. But my point is, how long does God let that happen? How long do you allow an unjust society to continue being unjust? How long would it have been okay to let Hitler and the German regime to keep doing what it was doing? Till all the Jews were gone? Till all of Western Europe and all of Eastern Europe were gone? How long do you let an unjust society continue? And that is a question that God is being faced with. And I'm not saying here that the Canaanites were the worst possible culture ever. We're not here arguing. The Bible is not arguing that they were just the worst, that there was no people ever like them before them or after them. The point is they were a proper target of God's judgment. And this started to get really out of hand. It's been argued by some archaeologists that there is evidence that the Canaanite practice of child sacrifices began to spread not just in the Mediterranean world, but as far as North Africa. In Carthage of North Africa, this is a statement regarding one of their practices out of reverence for Kronos, the Greek equivalent to Baal Hammon. Baal is a Canaanite deity. The Phoenicians, and especially the Carthaginians, whenever they seek to obtain some great favor, they vow one of their children, burning it as a sacrifice to the deity they are especially eager to gain success through. So the practice of the Canaanites began to grow. the influence was growing, and it seems to even have gone not just in the land of Palestine itself, into the Mediterranean broadly, and we have an example even in North Africa, Carthage. So how long do you let this keep going? So I think we have a really good question to ask. They have a question, why is God morally unjust for asking God to kill women, children, and cities and all of this stuff? Well, the other question to ask, though, is how long do you let an unjust society continue? How long does that? That's a serious counter question. Now, God was revealing his greatness over the Canaanite deities in war as it challenged their existence and power. We have to remember that in the Bible, God's earthly actions reflect something very real going on behind the scenes. If we understand anything about from Ephesians chapter 5, we understand there is a spiritual war going on. And that just didn't happen in the days of Paul or the Christians. It has been going on since the fall. Idolatry may seem harmless. What's so harmless about a statue? What's so harmless about a little wooden figure? But actually, it reflects a different kind of control. Those deities, those false gods, they don't offer leadership, they offer oppression. In the Exodus narrative, God is releasing the Israelites from the oppression of Pharaoh and their gods, the gods of Egypt. The plagues were not just demonstrations of wrath. God wasn't just angry. He wasn't just in a sandbox in Egypt saying, oh, look what I can do. Smashing things together, hulking out. God was doing specific, strategic attacks, undermining the Egyptians' entire religious system. Each plague can be connected to at least one deity of Egypt, at least one. Turning the river into blood, the river itself was a deity. So God, by doing that, was making their God bleed. Controlling the sun and darkness was against their God of the sun. I have the power. You have multiple gods to handle multiple elements of the world. Just me, myself, and I can control all of this. And the most untouchable deity was the Pharaoh. And his firstborn dies. All of this to echo a phrase throughout Exodus, that they may know that the Lord is God. Exodus 6:7, 7:5, 7:17, 8:22, and so on. So what we're looking at here is a cosmic battle that has been raging on already in Egypt, that has been going on before Egypt ever happened, ever came into being, and is continuing on through Israel, because it is with Israel that he will make his presence known. It is in Israel that he will lay down all the foundation for the work of salvation. So it's critical that even Israel has the same confidence, like the apostles do, that their God is truly God. Have you ever stopped to think about why the apostles in Acts chapter 2, when they were replacing Judas's apostleship, why the apostle there, who was going to take his role, had not only to be there at the baptism of John, but also had to be there through all the times Jesus went in and out among them. They had to be there at the baptism of John, and they had to be there all the way till he ascended. They had to have seen it, because they were going to go in and launch this kingdom on earth, the church, and they had to be true witnesses for the work given to them. No questions in their mind. Oh, I wasn't there at the baptism. Oh, well, then how did you see the Holy Spirit? Or how'd you hear about that? I was just kind of told. Well, I wasn't there at the ascension. Well, how do you know he went into heaven? I just believe that. I was just kind of told. Matthias and the other one, I forget, because he didn't win, so you don't remember them. he was there. They were there. They had 2 people only. Small select group. And that's a unique qualification. The same is true with Israel. We were there at the Exodus. We were there at the 10 plagues. We were there at the parting of the sea. We were there. And then the 40-year wanderings. We were there, and our shoes, our sandals never, we didn't have to go to the store to get new shoes. We were fed manna every day. God took care of us every single day. We were there. God is taking care of us. They had to be able to have the faith that would withstand the scrutiny of the nations around them. And this got out, and it proves, I think, an argument that I'm trying to make here, that God is demonstrating his greatness, because when they come to Jericho, they run into Rahab, and in Joshua 2, 9-11, Rahab says this, I know that the Lord has given you the land. I know it. Well, how do I know that? How does Rahab know that? And the fear of you has fallen upon us, and all the inhabitants of the land melt away before you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, whom you devoted to destruction. That's a Old Testament phrase for dealing with paganism, by the way. And as soon as we heard it, our hearts melted, and there was no spirit left in any man because of you. For the Lord your God, right? The Lord your God, he is God in the heavens above and on the earth beneath. The war was designed to show his greatness over false deities. There is a bigger picture at heart in these stories. It is a picture of a reality, that there is a God in heaven, and he exists exclusively on his own. And because of him, any false view of alternative deities skews reality, pollutes morality. So a war in the ancient world, by the way, was designed to settle who is the greater God. You'll find in the Old Testament that wars were used to settle who was the greater, more powerful God. All right, argument number 2. God commanded Israel to root out the influence of the Canaanite institutions. Now, one of these issues, of course, that we have to ask is, who gave Israel the right to war against and displace the Canaanites? I mean, that's a fair question. From a naturalistic point of view, who gives you the right to go to war with anybody? And who gives you the right to go and take land from another country? Right? Today, we live in a very politically respectable culture. We don't just go take land from other nations. That's not what you're supposed to do. Today, cities and nations, we just keep our terrain and we don't war anymore. I don't buy that we don't war anymore. The weapons of our warfare, I think, have just been changing. But my point is, who gives any nation the right to go into a country? Who gave Hitler the right to go into the Eastern Bloc or the Western and just conquer and take and take and take? Who would give the North Korea power to say, just go and take South Korea, go ahead? No one cares. We'd all say, who do these people think they are? So that's a fair question. A Israeli psychologist once, by the name of Georges Tamarin, said, we rightly condemn the killing of an ethnic group when carried out by Nazis or Hutus, but Israel seems to get a pass. Indeed, a divine order when doing the same thing to the Canaanites. So who gives Israel the right? And I've already outlined Nazi Germany's issues. But here's 2 things to think about. God provided Israel the why, and that makes all the difference in the world. It's one thing to say, I want what that country has. It's one thing to say, that country did something evil. It's another thing to have God, who can see the hearts of men, tell you, you have to go into this country and fight them. You have to go in and stop what they're doing. God explains and gives them all the reasons why. He explains their immoral practices in Deuteronomy 20, 16 to 18. But in the cities of these people that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance, you shall save alive nothing that breathes, but you should devote them to complete destruction. The Hittites and the Amorites, the Canaanites and the Perizzites, the Hivites and the Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded, that they may not teach you to do according to all their abominable practices that they have done for their gods, and so you sin against the Lord your God. God told them why. They are doing abominable things. He's already told them several times in Leviticus. We've already looked at it in Leviticus 18, offering up children and doing all sorts of other things. The second thing is God provided Israel with the when. Now, it's something to be told here. There's almost 400 years of patience from when God tells Abraham in the little footnote in Genesis that the sins of the Amorites has not yet been full. There's almost 400 years of patience. Think about it. We're in the middle of the halfway in our country. Rome lasted, for so long. At some point, God begins to change the pieces on the board. But the Bible reveals a God whose thinking is above ours. Isaiah 55, verse 8 and 9, my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your ways. I love a recent quote I heard from a guy named Francis Chan. He says, when I read the Bible and there's something in there I don't understand or agree with, I tell myself, the problem is not with the text, the problem is with me. The problem is with me. In 1 Corinthians 2, 10 to 13, Paul is very clear about God gives us his spirit when he's giving his spirit and information to his prophets. He says, who knows, verse 11, in 1 Corinthians 2, who knows a person's thoughts except the spirit of that person which is in him? So also no one comprehends the thoughts of God except the Spirit of God. Now we have received not the spirit of the world, but the Spirit who is from God, that we might understand the things freely given to us by God. And the Bible also continues to reveal, Paul tells us that he's in charge, God is in charge of the human affairs and human governments. In Acts 17, verse 26, he says this, and he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods in the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him, yet he is not actually far from each one of us. It is this God who is telling Israel how and why and when. They're not just capriciously doing it. And Adam Hamilton, in his book, I told you about him, he said, well, it's interesting because there's a inscription, an artifact of the Moabites. And in this, the Moabite king says, my God told me to go and to fight this people and to burn their cities to the ground and similar biblical language. He goes, that's all Israel is doing. They're just politicizing God. That might be what you think if you don't think God is actually involved in the Old Testament, which is a sad commentary of this person who was supposedly a counselor to President Obama, to not have that biblical knowledge set. But God was revealing the how and the when and the why. That's what gives Israel's attacks, if we use our modern language, they're warring against the Canaanites, legitimacy. They knew why. Because an unjust society cannot continue to go on and on indefinitely. At some point, justice must be served. At some point, it must be intervened and countermanded. Final argument here. God's command restrained Israel from committing genocide. This is for me one of the most shockingly, interestingly ones. Shockingly, that's not a real phrase. Shockingly interesting. In Exodus 23, 27 to 33, tell me if you've heard this. I will send my terror before you. and will throw into confusion all the people against whom you shall come. And I will make all your enemies turn their backs to you. That means I'm going to make them run. And I will send hornets before you, and which shall drive out the Hivites, the Canaanites, and the Hittites from before you. I will not drive them out from you in 1 year, lest the land become desolate and the wild beasts multiply against you. We're not going to make the land desolate. Little by little, I will drive them out from before you until you have increased and possessed the land. And I will set your border from the Red Sea to the Sea of the Philistines, and from the wilderness to the Euphrates, for I will give the inhabitants of the land into your hand, and you shall drive them out before you. They're going to be displaced. They're going to be pushed out. You shall make no covenant with them and their gods. They shall not dwell in your land, lest they make you sin against me. For if you serve their gods, it will surely be a snare to you. This is, I think, the first conquest directive, and it was not about ethnic cleansing. It's about driving them out, pushing them away, getting them out of the land, not obliterating them. Number 2, Israel was to offer terms of peace. And as conquered people, they would participate in the labor force of Israel. Deuteronomy 20, beginning verse 10, when you draw near to a city to fight against it, offer terms of peace to it. Have you ever heard that before? Offer terms of peace to it. And if it responds to you peaceably, and it opens to you, then all the people who are found in it shall do forced labor for you and shall serve you. There is a consequence of living and staying in Israel. You are here with us. You're not a part of Israel, but you're here. You're part of the work team. You're protected. You're part of Israel. Terms of peace were often to get rid of the gods and move, to be a participant like Rahab was. Like Rahab. But no one talks about that. In fact, Adam Hamilton says God never even gave them, quote, terms of peace. That is an actual quote from him. Yet here it goes. Terms of peace. Sometimes very scary. Israelite warriors could marry Canaanite women. You've heard about stories during World War II. You know, soldiers go out, they meet someone, they come back, and they're married. Guess what? It happened in Israel. In Deuteronomy 21, 10-14, when you go out to war against your enemies and the Lord your God gives them into your hand and you take them captive, and you see among the captives a beautiful woman, and you desire to take her to be your wife, and you bring her home to your house, she shall shave her head and pare her nails. This was an ancient custom of marriage and changing cultures. This is a mourning practice. And she shall take off the clothes in which she was captured in and shall remain in your house and lament her father and her mother for a full month. After that, you may go into her and be your husband, and she shall be your wife. But if you no longer delight in her, you shall let her go where she wants, but you shall not sell her for money, nor shall you treat her as a slave, since you have humiliated her. It's really hard to put into perspective the kind of protective clauses that are in here, especially for this woman. And it's really important to realize this is case law. This is very dispassionate. This is not just be rude to a woman. If you think she's beautiful, take her, shave her head, take her clothes off. And this is case law. This is a transition of a woman's culture, going from a Canaanite culture to an Israelite culture. And it was optional. If it didn't work out, she was allowed to be freed with no consequences. Canaanites and Philistines are seen throughout the Old Testament story. Samson, in the period of the Judges, confronts the Philistines over and over and over and over again. And one of David's mighty warriors was a Canaanite, Uriah the Hittite. And Jesus himself deals with the Syrophoenician woman, which is basically a Canaanite. And that's where you get the interesting proverb of, I shall not take the food and give it to dogs. And she goes, but even the dogs get to eat the crumbs. Woman, I have not seen anyone's faith like this in all of Israel. And Jesus heals her daughter. This is a very powerful question. Is God morally unjust in the Old Testament? I think in this, when we consider what's at stake here, we have to answer the question, but we also have to realize that there are areas that we really need to put on the table to respond. Does God have a right to judge an unjust society? How long do you let an unjust society continue? Number two, God wasn't just warring for funsies. He was proving he was real at a time that was crucial to the story of redemption. This is all connected to Jesus. So you can't dismiss Jesus, because without this, there is no Jesus. Number two, God offered to Israel, ways to prevent genocide. And so these are all important ways to talk through this. So I hope this has been a helpful talk. So thank you so much, and God bless you.